Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. What if I told you that America's most popular national park has been concealing 8 horrifying secrets for more than 200 years? I'm referring to the Great Smoky Mountains, where the Cherokee people once whispered warnings about places so cursed that even they refused to speak their names after dark inspection. I know that the majority of you watching this haven't clicked the subscribe button yet, and to be honest, that I'm risking everything tonight to reveal 8 documented cases of supernatural terror that park rangers don't want tourists to know about. These aren't just campfire stories. They are confirmed accounts of ancient curses, vengeful spirits, and creatures that have been claiming victims for generations. It breaks my heart because I spend countless sleepless nights researching these stories just to bring you the truth that others are too afraid to share. If you've ever felt completely alone in the dark, or if you've ever felt like someone was watching you from the shadows, you should stay with me through all of these stories, because what I'm about to reveal will forever alter your perception of America's most cherished wilderness. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the Cherokee called these mountains the land of blue smoke, and I assure you that it has nothing to do with the weather. There once lived a creature so terrifying that Cherokee mothers would pull their children close at the mention of her name. They called her Atlanta, but you may know her by her English name, Spearfinger. This story is told by the Cherokee child slayer Spearfinger, deep in the heart of Chilhoy Mountain, where the morning mist clings to ancient oaks like ghostly fingers. Before you assume this is just another campfire tale, let me tell you something that will chill you to the bone. The Cherokee didn't make up folklore for fun. Every legend, story, and whispered warning had a purpose to keep their people alive. And Spearfinger was the reason Cherokee kids never ventured out into the deep woods by themselves. When a Cherokee child in the 1700s, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, is playing close to your village, then you hear your grandmother's voice calling from the edge of the forest, asking you to come closer, because she has something special to show you. You rush in the direction of the sound because, after all, why wouldn't you trust the woman who has sung you to sleep every night of your life? The voice is correct, but as you get closer, something feels off. The shadows appear to deepen dark, and there's a sound like stones scraping against stones that makes your skin crawl. You stop in terror, and then you see her emerge from behind the trees. She looks just like your grandmother, complete with the same weathered. Your world turns to ice when she raises her right hand to call you closer. Instead of her index finger, there is a spear, a long, sharp stone blade that gleams with something dark and wet. Her finger has been replaced by a weapon, and as she smiles, her face, kind eyes, and gentle smile that has brought you comfort through innumerable nightmares are all gone. Your legs won't move when you try to run because of Spearfinger's power, which is to paralyze you with fear and lock your muscles in place as she approaches with that awful scraping sound. Every step she takes sounds like stone grinding against stone, because her skin isn't skin at all. Her teeth are stained red, and her eyes have a primitive, hungry look that wasn't there in your real grandmother's gaze. The Cherokee warriors learned this the hard way when they attempted to kill her with arrows and spears, only to have their weapons shatter against her stone flesh like twigs against a mountain. This is where the story gets really scary, though, because the Spearfinger doesn't just kill, she feeds, and what she feeds on will make you sick. The rock is impenetrable and ancient, covering a creature that has been hunting in these mountains since before your people's grandparents were born. She tells you how hungry she is, and how long it has been since she last had a proper meal as she approaches, still wearing your grandmother's face and speaking in your grandmother's voice. She also explains, almost lovingly, that she will use that Spearfinger to cut you open, and then reach inside and remove your liver, while you are still alive to watch, because that is how Spearfinger consumes livers of children, and in accordance with Cherokee custom, she prefers them warm and fresh, torn from living bodies, while the heart is still beating. The most terrifying thing about her is that she could be anyone: your father asking you to help with chores, your mother inviting you over for dinner, your best friend suggesting that you visit a new area of the forest, or Spearfinger being the most Cherokee parents would teach their children to always look at people's hands and to never approach anyone whose right index finger they couldn't clearly see. However, even knowing her secret didn't guarantee safety. She was a shapeshifter who could perfectly mimic the appearance and voice of anyone you trusted. The only way to identify her was that Spearfinger, but by the time you were close enough to see it, it was already too late. Children would discover the truth seconds before the stone blade pierced their flesh, just long enough to comprehend that the person they trusted most in the world was actually their killer. Spearfinger learned to conceal her weapon, so she would approach as a cherished relative, keep her right hand behind her back or tucked in her clothes, and only reveal the Spearfinger at the last minute. The Cherokee made every effort to stop her, including setting traps, organizing hunting parties, and even trying to locate her lair deep within the mountain caves. However, Spearfinger was a crafty and ancient woman who would vanish for months, or even years, leading people to believe she was gone forever. Then, just as the villages were beginning to calm down and parents were allowing their kids to play outside once more, she would always return when families were most at risk, such as during harvest season when adults were working in the fields, or during the winter months when the long nights made for ideal cover for her hunts. What's most terrifying, though, is how she would examine her victims. Cherokee elders describe how children saw their relatives acting strangely in the days leading up to a spear. These weren't the real relatives. They were Spearfinger learning to perfect her disguise, studying the family dynamics, and knowing exactly how to gain each child's trust. She struck a grandmother who stood too still for too long, a mother whose smile never quite reached her eyes, and an uncle who forgot simple family stories that he should have known by heart. Spearfinger, according to the Cherokee, relished the fear that she would gradually reveal her true nature to the child, letting them understand what was about to happen. Her familiar face would start to change, her skin would turn grey and hard like stone, and that awful Spearfinger would come out of hiding. However, the worst part was that even as her appearance changed, she would continue to speaking. In her impersonator's voice, she created a terrifying gap between the monster you were seeing and the loved one you were hearing. According to some, the Cherokee eventually vanquished Spearfinger by figuring out that her right hand was her weak spot, the same hand that held the Spearfinger warriors, and striking her there in combat, causing her to crumble to dust like an old stone. The Cherokee believes Spearfinger is still out there, claiming she has learned to adapt to modernize her hunting techniques. In the early 1900s, there were reports of children going missing near Chilhoy, but others whisper that she wasn't destroyed, but rather injured, and that she withdrew deep into Chilhoy Mountain to heal and wait. Park rangers wrote off these as animal attacks when their bodies were discovered days later, with precise surgical wounds where their livers had been removed. But the Cherokee elders knew better. They recognized the Spearfinger's signature. The cuts were almost surgically precise. The liver was the only organ removed. The children were discovered in locations that would have been impossible for a typical predator to reach. And in recent years, well, let me ask you this. How many times have you received a text from a family member asking you to meet up somewhere, only to discover that they never sent it? How many times have you heard your name called in the woods, turned around, and discovered that no one was there? The Cherokee claim that Spearfinger has mastered the use of technology against us, being able to imitate our voices on phones, send phony messages, and even appear the next time you're hiking in the Smoky Mountains and you hear a familiar voice calling from the trees. You should carefully examine their hands before responding, because in these ancient mountains, where the mist conceals secrets older than civilization, Spearfinger is still hunting, and she's still a creature that represents one of humanity's darkest truths, that curiosity can damn your soul forever. Prowls the deepest hollows of the Great Smoky Mountains, where the ancient Cherokee once held their most sacred ceremonies. Not only is the creature itself terrifying, but so was her creation. The Wampus Cat was originally a woman named Artsela, who lived in a Cherokee village in what is now the center of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Centuries ago, the forests were deeper, darker, and teeming with mysteries that are beyond the comprehension of modern humans. Her only transgression was wanting to know what the men were concealing. While other women were happy with their traditional roles, Artsela was renowned throughout her village for her fierce intelligence and insatiable curiosity. She constantly questioned everything, including why some parts of the forest were off limits to women, and why the men conducted secret ceremonies that were hidden from female observers. Why the Cherokee had stringent sacred laws regarding their spiritual ceremonies, especially the hunting, magic, and war rituals carried out by the tribe's men. These laws weren't merely customs, they were cosmic boundaries that maintained the harmony between the material and spiritual realms, and women had their own potent ceremonies and sacred knowledge. Artsela didn't believe in boundaries. She thought that knowledge belonged to anyone brave enough to seek it. The night that changed everything began like any other autumn, but the male rituals were forbidden territory because the tribal elders taught that combining the energies and letting the wrong eyes witness the wrong ceremonies could tear holes in reality itself. On this particular evening, the men of the village had assembled for a sacred hunting ceremony, which is one of the most potent and powerless customs in Cherokee tradition. This ceremony would call upon spirits so old and wild that they existed before humans learned to speak, entities that controlled life and death, and the primal forces that govern predator and prey knew only the rudimentary language of fang and claw, and the atmosphere surrounding the ceremony would be charged with predatory energy, turning the participants into spiritual hunters who could track not only animals, but also souls. Artsela was aware of the ceremony and was driven to learn what secrets the men were learning and what power they were gaining that was considered too risky for women to observe. As night fell and the men vanished into the sacred grove, which was located deep within the forest, Artsela decided to follow them, hide in the shadows, and eventually discover the truth that had been withheld from her entire life. The sacred grove was a place where the trees grew in perfect circles and the earth itself appeared to pulse with ancient power. The Cherokee people thought that this was a narrow area where the spirit world pressed up against the material world. As Artsela made her way through the underbrush, she sensed that she was in the wrong place. The forest itself seemed to shudder at her. The animals went quiet, and even the wind stopped. Nevertheless, her curiosity overcame her fear, and she continued until she discovered the ideal hiding place behind a huge oak that had been watching over these woods for more than a millennium. And what she witnessed when the ceremony started contradicted everything she knew about reality. The men of her village were standing in a circle around a fire that burned with outward flames, dancing in colors that she couldn't name. They were wearing masks made of materials that appeared to move and writhe in the firelight, and they were chanting. The air thickened as their voices blended with sounds that came from a human throat, and Artsela watched in awe and horror as shadows started to move apart from the bodies that cast them. However, the true transformation started when the men began to change one by one, not their bodies, but as each man's spiritual essence assumed the form of their hunting animal. Artsela's vision was enhanced by the magical energy permeating the grove. She saw her own brother change into a wolf in spirit, her uncle change into a giant bear, and the village chief's soul take the shape of a huge mountain lion, all of them merging with the predator. The ancient spirits leading the ceremony suddenly sensed her presence when spirits gained the ability to hunt not only in the physical world, but also in the realm of dreams and nightmares. These were not good spirits, rather, they were primordial forces of nature that existed long before ideas like mercy or forgiveness. For them, Artsila's presence was a violation so severe that it was like the spirits turned their attention toward her hiding place, and Artsila felt their gaze like ice in her veins. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her, and she tried to scream, but no sound would come the last time. A scream in a sacred silence meant that the very foundations of cosmic law had been broken, and punishment was not just inevitable, but automatic. When Artsila woke up, she realized right away that something was seriously wrong. She tried to stand, but her body moved differently, and she looked down at her hands. One of the things she remembered as a human was the feeling of falling not through space, but through reality itself, tumbling through layers of existence until she landed somewhere that was neither fully physical nor completely spiritual, and saw enormous clawed paws that belonged to no earthly creature. Her reflection in a nearby stream told her the terrible reality that she had changed into something that was not human, but rather a terrifying combination of both. She stood erect like a woman, but had the body of a huge wild cat, and her face was still recognizable, but twisted and stretched with fangs that protruded from Artsila's mouth, and eyes glowed with an unholy light. But the physical change was small in comparison to the curse that had been placed on her mind. She kept all of her human intelligence, memories, and emotions, but on top of them was an unquenchable desire for violence and an uncontrollable urge to hunt. She was stuck in a predator's. The spirits had created the ideal punishment and eternal awareness of what she had lost and what she had become for her to watch herself commit acts of savagery while helpless to stop them. The worst part was the loneliness Artsila felt, as she was never able to return to her village, speak to another human, or explain what had happened, or why she was destined to wander the mountains forever, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. During the day, she would hide in the deepest caves, struggling with her human memories and the developing animal instincts that threatened to devour what was left of her humanity. At night, however, when her hunting compulsion became too great to ignore, she would prowl the forest, her 6 legs carrying her faster than any natural creature, looking for prey. Satisfy an insatiable hunger, the Cherokee heard her cry before they saw her, and it was unlike anything in nature, a cry that was a combination of human sob and feline yawl, so heartbreaking and terrifying that it would chill anyone who heard it. Hunters would report seeing tracks that made no sound. Travelers would report seeing a huge cat-like creature standing upright at the edge of the forest, watching them with eyes that held intelligence, after they noticed paw prints that were too big and too deep, arranged in a pattern that suggested something walking upright. Livestock started to disappear from the villages, not eaten, but killed with precision that spoke of intelligence behind the slaughter. The bravest hunters attempted to track the Wampus Cat, but she appeared to exist partially outside of reality. She could disappear into shadows that weren't deep enough to hide anything, leap distances that defied physics, and some people claimed they could see the ghost of a woman's face in the creature's features, a human soul trapped behind animal eyes. As the decades went by, Artsila's human memories started to wane, but never entirely vanished. She would occasionally have flashbacks to her life as a woman, and during those times, her anguish was so intense that her cries could be heard 4 miles. Cherokee mothers would recognize the sound and bring their kids inside, knowing that the Wampus, because Artsila's grief would push her to seek out human contact in an attempt to return to the world she could never be a part of again. These were the most dangerous times for her. Early settlers in the area told stories of a huge cat-like creature that would approach their cabins at night while standing just at the edge of the firelight. The creature would make sounds that were almost like the Cherokee elders claimed that Artsila's punishment was intended to serve as a warning for all future generations. teaching that curiosity is a virtue. The creature would speak if it were attempting to communicate, trying to explain itself, but whenever someone approached, it would run away, leaving behind only enormous paw prints and the lingering sense that they had encountered something tragic beyond measure. The story of the Wampus Cat became a warning to young Cherokee women who showed too much interest in forbidden knowledge, reminding them that some boundaries exist for reasons more important than sating curiosity. Without wisdom, one of the most dangerous traits a human can possess is that some knowledge comes with a price too terrible to pay. But here's what makes this: rangers in the Great Smoky Mountains receive reports every year of hikers hearing inexplicable nighttime sounds that are part animal and part human, filled with a sadness so deep that it seems to reverberate from the mountains themselves. The Cherokee believe that the Wampus Cat is still alive. In recent decades, hikers have reported finding livestock killed with surgical precision miles from any farm, their bodies arranged in patterns, suggesting intelligence behind the slaughter. At night, photographers have also captured images of something moving through the forest. The figure watching them from the tree line is something that disappears the moment they try to get a closer look. The sounds that park visitors have recorded on their phones, that wildlife experts are unable to recognize cries that appear to contain human words mixed with animal vocalizations, are the most terrifying of all. They are too big to be a typical wild cat and too fast to be human, but somehow combining elements of both. The Cherokee warned that the Wampus Cat is attracted to people who, if you're the kind of person who explores abandoned buildings, seeks out dangerous urban legends, and can't resist investigating strange sounds in the night, you might catch her attention. Sila's fatal flaw is her insatiable curiosity about things that should remain hidden. It's said that she recognizes kindred spirits, people who push boundaries and refuse to accept that some knowledge is forbidden. Remember the story of Attila. The next time camping in the Smoky Mountains and you hear something moving through the forest that doesn't sound like any animal you know. If you see glowing eyes watching you from the darkness, they seem to hold far too much pain and far too much intelligence. Some curses are born from the very human desire to know more than we should. The price of forbidden knowledge is still being paid every night in these ancient mountains by a woman who discovered too late that some secrets are kept hidden for a reason. The Wampus Cat is still hunting, still crying, still trapped between worlds, and she's constantly searching for someone who might comprehend the terrible weight of knowing too much tale. Don't try to investigate. Don't let your curiosity pull you closer. On a bone-chilling November night in 1900, when the first frost had turned the Great Smoky Mountains leaves into a tapestry of death, a man named Forster Williamson was making his way home through the meandering forest paths close to what is now the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. Forster was a practical man who still rides tonight, the barefoot phantom of Roaring Fork. Because of what happened to him that night, his rational worldview would be so completely shattered that he would spend the rest of his life as a broken, haunted shell of the man he once was. He was a blacksmith by trade, and he didn't believe in ghost stories or mountain superstitions. Instead, he trusted in things that he could hammer into shape with his own two hands. Below freezing, and as his horse cautiously navigated the perilous mountain trail, the only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves on frozen ground and the far-off roar of Roaring Fork Creek, swollen by autumn rains and early snow melt. Forster was excited to return home to his cozy cabin and his wife, but he was also an adventurer. When Forster first saw her, it was just after midnight. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Perhaps it was a deer caught in the pale moonlight, or perhaps it was a trick of shadows cast by the bare branches overhead. Forster was an experienced mountain traveler who knew better than to push his horse too hard on the icy trails, as one wrong step could send them both tumbling into the rocky ravines that bordered the narrow path. A young woman was walking along the side of the treacherous mountain road in the bitter November cold. Her skin was so pale that it seemed to glow in the moonlight, and her long dark hair seemed to float around her shoulders like water. However, what stopped Forster's heart was that she was not wearing a coat or shoes. As he got closer, the shape solidified into something that made his blood run cold. Forster put his horse to a halt and yelled out to her, his voice resonating oddly in the thin mountain air. Miss, are you all right? You'll freeze to death out here." He had done nothing to shield her from the deadly cold that had already started to form ice crystals on his horse's mane. Forster felt his breath catch in his throat as the woman turned to face him. She smiled at him with a heartbreaking and captivating smile, and when she spoke, her voice was like music made from moonlight and sorrow. Her face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, with features so flawless they seemed to have been carved by angels, but her eyes held a sadness so deep and profound that Forster felt tears well up in his own eyes just looking at her. To have become disoriented, she murmured, her voice barely audible above a whisper, "I'm attempting to find my way home, but the paths all appear identical in the dark." Her bare feet on the icy ground caught Forster's attention, but she displayed, even though her breath should have been audible in the cold air. There were no signs of discomfort, no shivering, and no chattering teeth. Something deep inside of him lay to tell him that this was wrong, that no human could survive in this weather barefoot, but the woman's beauty and obvious distress overcame his reasonable thoughts. "Please," Forster heard himself saying. His voice sounding, the woman's smile brightened as she approached his horse with a grace that seemed to defy the rough terrain. "You're very kind," she said, taking his hand and climbing up behind him on the horse. Funny and distant to his own ears, "Let me give you a ride. If you stay out here, you'll die of exposure. My name is Lucy," as she calmed down as they rode. Through the night, Lucy pressed close against Forster's back, and he found himself falling more and more under her spell. She spoke to him in that melodic voice about the beauty of the mountains, how the moonlight painted the frost-covered trees silver, and the peace that could only be found when Forster felt her arms encircle his waist. Despite the freezing temperatures, her touch seemed to warm him from the inside out. Her words seemed to seep into his very being in these old hills, and Forster found himself opening up to someone he had never told before about his dreams, fears, and secret desire for something more significant than the never-ending cycle of heating iron and hammering metal that characterized his life. The trip, which should have taken 30 minutes, took hours, but Forster didn't mind, because he had never felt so alive and connected to another human being. Lucy's presence seemed to make everything more vivid, with colors appearing more realistic, sounds carrying deeper meaning, and even the cold night air seeming to sing with hidden music when Lucy laughed at something he said. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Lucy led Forster to a small cabin tucked away in a grove of ancient oak trees near the headwaters of Roaring Fork Creek. The cabin was modest but well maintained, with smoke rising from the chimney and warm yellow light, Forster said, and he was certain that he was falling in love with this mysterious woman who had appeared to him like a vision from a dream. "This is my home," Lucy declared as Forster helped her down from the horse. Her feet touched the ground silently, and Forster saw that despite their lengthy journey through the muddy forest paths, there was not a single mark on her bare feet or a speck of dirt on her dress. Lucy turned to face Forster, and in the gradually increasing dawn light, Forster could see. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, reaching up to touch his cheek with fingers that felt like silk and cool water. "I won't forget what you've done for me tonight," she said, acknowledging that her beauty was even more remarkable than he had realized. Her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom far beyond her apparent years, and her skin seemed to have an inner light. As she turned to walk toward the cabin, Forster felt a desperation rise in his chest. He couldn't let her go, couldn't let this magical night end. "Lucy," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion, "shall I see you again?" "Perhaps," she murmured, "but be careful what you wish for." Forster Williamson, as she stopped in the doorway and turned to face him with a heartbreaking smile. Some meetings are meant to happen only once. Forster was left alone with his horse as she vanished into the cabin. Forster rode home in a daze, his mind replaying every moment of the night, every word Lucy had said, every touch of her hand. By the time he got to his own cabin, he had made a decision that would ruin his life. He was going to marry Lucy, no matter what, and he would go to her father to declare his intentions and make her his wife. He went through the motions of his everyday routine that day, but his thoughts were solely on Lucy. He planned what he would say to her father, imagined the life they would create together, dreamed of the children they would have, and the fact that he was already married and had a wife waiting for him at home seemed like a far-off and insignificant detail compared to the overwhelming love he felt for the mysterious woman of the mountains, Forster. He saddled his horse and rode back toward the cabin where he had left her, his heart racing with nervous excitement and anticipation. However, when Forster arrived at the grove of oak trees where Lucy's cabin had stood, he discovered nothing but empty forest, no cabin, no chimney smoke, no warm yellow light. Forster frantically searched, thinking he had somehow taken the wrong turn, but every landmark was exactly where it should be. The creek was in the right place, the distinctive rock formation was unchanged, and even the lightning-stricken pine tree he had used as a marker was exactly where he remembered it. There was even a clearing where a cabin could have stood, and the trees grew thick and undisturbed, their massive trunks showing no signs of recent disturbance. Forster drove to the closest neighbor's cabin, owned by the Oglesbys, an old mountain family who had lived in these hills for 3 generations. He said, "I'm looking for a young woman named Lucy," explaining the house's location and that she lived close to Roaring Fork Creek's headwaters. The Oglesbys. Forster felt his world tilt on its axis as they exchanged glances, and he noticed something flicker in their eyes, a mixture of fear and sympathy. And Old Man Oglesby said slowly, "There hasn't been anybody living up that way for almost 15 years, not since the cabin fire." "What cabin fire?" Mrs. Oglesby said, taking her husband's arm, her knuckles white with the strength of her grip. "Lucy Henderson's cabin," whispering sweetly. "When a log rolled out of the fireplace one winter night, probably in 1885 or so, while the family was sleeping, Lucy's parents managed to escape, but Lucy trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But Lucy did what Forster demanded, even though a part of him already knew the answer, and was yelling at him that Lucy was burned to death in that fire. And when they found her body the following morning, it was so badly burned that they could hardly identify her. The odd thing is that she was discovered in the doorway, seemingly attempting to escape, but she had no shoes on." And he paused, swallowing. He whispered, "I spoke with her, I touched her, and she was real." But even as he said those words, Forster felt the world spinning around him and his vision tunneling as the implications crashed over him, a mountain avalanche. Her feet were burned clean off, and she died while attempting to flee the fire while running barefoot through the flames. The pieces started to come together. Lucy's bare feet, which never got dirty. Her breath, which didn't mist in the freezing air. The way she had seemed to float rather than walk. The cabin, which appeared and vanished like smoke. Mrs. Oglesby, who touched Forster's arm with tender sympathy. "You're not the first person to see her son. Lucy has been walking these roads before." She stopped to study Forster's distraught face. "But you're the first to say she spoke to you and the first to say she rode with them. That's never happened before. Some say she doesn't know she's dead and is still trying to escape that burning cabin. Others believe she's stuck here, doomed to wander until she finds peace." He had fallen in love with a ghost and shared the most private moments of his life with a woman who had been dead for 15 years. But what haunted Forster the most was not the supernatural aspect of his encounter, but rather the memory of Lucy's sadness and the deep grief he had seen in her eyes. Forster rode home that night in a state of shock so complete that he could hardly function. She wasn't just a ghost aimlessly wandering through the mountains. She was. As the weeks went by, Forster found himself unable to eat, sleep, or concentrate on anything but his memories of that impossible night when his wife begged him to tell her what was wrong. He was a soul in agony, trapped by the traumatic circumstances of her death, and he kept reliving her last moments of terror and pain. Forster, who had fallen in love with a deceased woman, began riding the mountain roads every night in the hopes of seeing Lucy again. He was desperate to know what had happened and why he had been selected for this encounter, and at times he thought he caught a glimpse of her in his peripheral vision. However, he knew that Lucy's touch was the caress of death itself. A pale figure was walking along the side of the road, but when he looked straight ahead, nothing was there. Other times, he heard her voice calling his name on the mountain wind with the same melodic quality that had mesmerized him, but the sound would fade before he could identify its source. Forster's obsession took over his life, and he stopped eating regularly, stopped working, and stopped working altogether. Friends and neighbors started speculating that Forster had gone insane because something had broken inside him during his nighttime mountain rides. But Forster knew he wasn't crazy because he was real with Lucy. Their connection was real, and for some reason he couldn't comprehend. The line between life and death had been blurred. Eventually, his wife left him, unable to compete with the memory of a deceased woman for her husband's affections. Forster's hair turned white, his face became gaunt and haunted, and his eyes took on the wild look of a man who had seen too much. Years passed, and Forster aged quickly under the weight of his obsession. He spent every night riding the mountain roads in search of Lucy, calling her name into the darkness, sometimes other times. In 1923, Forster was discovered frozen to death next to his horse on the same stretch of road where he had first met Lucy. The horse was unharmed, but Forster's body displayed signs of a strange and peaceful death, as if he had died there. Travelers would describe seeing him as a wild-looking man on horseback shouting at empty air and pleading with shadows that no one else could see. The story takes a terrifying turn when Forster's death didn't end the encounters with Lucy. Rather, it intensified them. Park rangers and visitors to the Great Smoky Mountains started reporting sightings of not one, but two figures walking along the path. Forster simply lay down in the snow and chose not to get back up. Those who found him said he had a smile on his face, the first smile anyone had seen from him over 20 years. The encounters follow a pattern that has remained constant for more than a century. A lone traveler, usually someone driving or hiking late at night, will spot two people in the Roaring Fork area, a tall man who matched Forster's description and a beautiful young woman in a white dress, barefoot and glowing in the moonlight. They were always seen together, walking hand in hand, and always appearing to travelers who were alone on the mountain roads at night. Good Samaritans who stop to offer assistance report that the couple approaches their vehicle with the woman climbing into the back seat while the man stays outside. The woman, who always introduces herself as Lucy, will give directions to a location near Roaring Fork Creek while conversing with the driver. The woman appears to be in distress and her companion appears to be attempting to assist her. Although Lucy was once just a lost soul in need of assistance, the addition of Forster has transformed the haunting into something far more dangerous. Witnesses say that Forster's spirit appears possessive and envious of anyone who shows kindness to Lucy, including men who offer to help. This is what makes these contemporary encounters truly terrifying. Lucy no longer travels alone, or exposed to Forster's ghost's increasingly violent behavior, which includes unexplained mechanical breakdowns in their cars, abrupt temperature drops, and an intense feeling of rage and jealousy that can push normally sensible people to dangerous extremes. Women who come into contact with the couple experience a different kind of horror, as Lucy, possibly motivated by jealousy over Forster's obsessive love, has grown more antagonistic toward other women. Modern reports are consistent in describing how these incidents occur. Female drivers report that Lucy's beautiful face changes during the journey, becoming twisted with rage and envy. Her musical voice becomes harsh and threatening, and she starts making accusations that the driver is attempting to steal Forster's attention by threatening terrible retribution for imagined slights. As the car gets closer to the location where Lucy's cabin used to be, the encounters come to an end. Both spirits start to transform. Their forms become more transparent, their voices take on an echoing quality, and the temperature inside the car drops significantly. Lucy's directions become more frantic and confused, as though she's reliving her own disorientation. The last moments of Forster's presence become unbearable, filling the car with an intense sense of jealousy and possessive rage. And then, as abruptly as they appeared, both spirits disappear, leaving the driver alone on a pitch-black mountain road with no recollection of how they got there. Vehicles are frequently discovered with mysterious scratches and damage that appear to like fingernails on the interior windows that are fogged over in spite of clear weather, and the persistent smoke odor that cannot be eliminated by cleaning. But the most unsettling part of these contemporary encounters is what happens to those who have them, like Forster before them. Many of them develop an obsession with going back to the mountains in hopes of seeing Lucy and Forster again. Some people completely give up their regular lives and spend every night driving through the Smokies, calling out to spirits who might or might not respond. Park rangers have recorded dozens of cases of visitors who claim to have given rides to Lucy and Forster, and the others who feel a strong urge to drive the mountain roads at night in search of the pale figures who seem to promise answers to questions they didn't know they had. The psychological effects on these people are severe and long-lasting. Many report having nightmares about being trapped in burning buildings with no way out, while others become obsessed with the idea of death as a romantic reunion and develop risky ideas about joining Lucy and Forster on their never-ending wandering. The Cherokee elders, who still reside in the area, provide an alternative viewpoint on Lucy's. According to Cherokee tradition, Forster's intense love created a spiritual bond that survived death, but over time, that bond has become corrupted. What started out as love has turned into possession, and Lucy is no longer wandering in search of peace. They believe that Lucy's spirit became trapped not only by the trauma of her death, but also by Forster's obsessive love. Forster's spirit should have moved on after death, according to Cherokee spiritual beliefs, but his obsession with Lucy kept him bound to the physical world. His presence has corrupted Lucy's haunting, turning her from a lost soul in need of assistance into something far more dangerous. The elders warned that the couple feeds off the emotional energy of living people. Forster is stuck in an endless cycle of jealousy and need. The next time you're driving alone through the Great Smoky Mountains late at night, and you see two figures on the side of the road, a tall man who appears to be helping her and a beautiful woman dressed in white, remember Forster's story and the feelings of love, loneliness, and romantic longing that compel people to stop and assist them. Stories are twisted by death, and if you feel compelled to stop because something deep inside of you demands that you help these lost souls, ask yourself if you're ready to join a tragic cycle of obsession and possession that has been going on for more than a century and has already claimed more victims than you might think. Lucy is still alive. These mountain roads are still barefoot in the never-ending cold, but she is no longer lost or alone. Instead, she has transformed into something much more dangerous, a ghost driven by the corrupted love of a man who couldn't let her go. Not even in death, she searches for a new companion every night to share her never-ending, tormented journey through the Smoky Mountains darkness. Tale 4. The Cussing cover death by there once lived a couple whose love story would become one of the most terrifying cautionary tales in all of Appalachian folklore. It is the story of Basil and Mavis Estep, and a handmade quilt that would become a tool of supernatural vengeance so powerful that morning mist clings to weathered cabins like the breath of the dead in the shadow-draped valley of Cad's Cove. Locals continue to avoid discussing its name after dark. What makes this story especially terrifying is that every detail is recorded and confirmed by witnesses who survived to share it, even though some would contend that experiencing what they did was the worst fate possible. Mavis Estep settled in Cad's Cove in 1887, long before the Great Smoky Mountains were created. Their cabin was a simple two-room building made from chestnut logs that Basil had cut himself, chinked with red clay from the valley floor, and roofed with hand-split oak shingles. From the outside, it wasn't much to look at, but inside, Mavis had created a home for a close-knit community of mountain folk who lived by their own laws and ancient superstitions in Mountains National Park. Mavis was born on a night when lightning struck the valley 17 times and thunder shook the very foundations of the earth. Her mother always said that Mavis came into the world screaming with the voice of the gods, and her home was filled with her handmade quilts, each one a masterpiece of color and craftsmanship that told the story of their life together, storm itself, and she showed an abnormal fear of lightning from an early age that far exceeded typical childhood anxiety. As she grew older, this fear turned into a crippling phobia that controlled every part of her life. Mavis became convinced with a sense of uncertainty that made everyone who knew her feel uneasy that she was destined to die by lightning strike. And this wasn't just superstition or anxiety. Mavis had an almost supernatural ability to predict impending storms hours before they arrived. When the barometric pressure started to drop, she would become restless and agitated, pacing their tiny cabin like a caged animal. She could also feel the electrical charge building in the atmosphere, and during thunderstorms, she would withdraw to the center of there as far away from windows and walls as possible. They curled into a ball on the floor and trembled uncontrollably as each lightning strike illuminated the outside world. But, most importantly for our story, Mavis forbade anything metal from being in their bedroom because she believed it would attract the lightning that was headed for her. As a result, Basil and Mavis slept on a basic wooden bed frame that Basil had constructed with his own hands, combined with rawhide strips and wooden pegs rather than metal bolts or nails. The bed was sufficiently sturdy, but it symbolized something more profound: Mavis's desperate attempt to manipulate the uncontrollable in order to somehow defy the fate that she felt had been predetermined by the stars the night she was born. Basil, who loved his wife more than life itself, never asked her why she was afraid or attempted to convince her that her fears were unreasonable. Instead, he just adjusted their lives to accommodate her anxiety and create a metal-free haven where Mavis could find a little peace. In this metal-free bedroom, Mavis worked on her quilts for many hours, producing masterpieces that were well known throughout Cad's Cove and beyond. Each quilt was different, but they all had certain traits that made them clearly Mavis's work: complex geometric patterns that seemed to move and dance in shifting light-color combinations that ought to have clashed but instead produced perfect harmony, and the stitching was so impeccable that it appeared almost machine-made even though it was completely handmade. However, one quilt stood out from the others. It was so exquisite and flawless that it seemed to have an almost supernatural power. Mavis called it her. The design was unlike anything she had ever tried before, with a brilliant red flannel square that seemed to glow with its own inner light, surrounded by concentric circles of fabric in shades of blue, green, and gold that spiraled around it. Although she never gave it a formal name during her lifetime, it was larger than her other quilts, large enough to cover their wooden bed with extra fabric. Mavis worked on this quilt for more than 2 years, stitching by candlelight on long winter evenings and by window light on shorter days. She approached the work with an almost religious devotion, often becoming so absorbed in her stitching. The stitching was so intricate that looking at it for too long could make you dizzy, as if the pattern was somehow moving and drawing your eye inexorably toward that blazing red center. When neighbors inquired about the quilt, Mavis would only respond that it was protection against the storm, but she never gave a detailed explanation. Basil would find her hunched over the quilt at all hours of the night, her fingers moving with superhuman speed and precision, adding layer upon layer of detail to what was already an incredibly complex piece. What she meant by that cryptic phrase, was that the quilt was finished in the spring of 1902, and bizarre things started happening in the Estep cabin as soon as Mavis laid it across their wooden bed. The first indication was the way the animals responded to it. Dogs would not go into the bedroom. Cats would arch their backs and hiss when they were close to the quilt. And even the mice that infested most mountain cabins seemed to avoid that room altogether. What was even more unsettling were the on humid days. The red flannel square in the middle would appear to shimmer with static electricity, and Basil repeatedly swore he could hear a faint humming sound coming from the fabric, the sound of power lines in a thunderstorm. Electrical phenomena that started to occur around the quilt included metal objects brought close to it developing a subtle charge that caused tiny sparks to jump between fingers and doorknobs. The most disturbing effect, however, was on Mavis herself. After sleeping beneath her masterpiece quilt for a few weeks, she started to change in ways that bothered everyone who knew her. Her lifelong fear of lightning started to fade and was replaced by something that was almost like anticipation. During thunderstorms, she would stand at the windows and watch the lightning with an expression that Basil found extremely distressing. She started discussing the impending storm as something she was ready to face on her own terms and not something to be feared. Unfortunately, Mavis's preparations would prove inadequate, and in the fall of 1903, she fell ill with a wasting disease that no mountain remedy could cure, and she died in their wooden bed beneath her masterpiece quilt. Mavis forced Basil to make two promises that would guarantee their deaths. First, he would never sell any of her quilts. They would be kept in the family forever as mementos of their love that would endure beyond death. And second, and perhaps most crucially, he would never, ever put any of her quilts on a metal bed. Basil was devastated by Mavis's passing, but he was also a pragmatic man who recognized that life must go on. A period of mourning that lasted through the harsh winter of 1903-1904, and he was able to withstand the intensity of her final request, even as death claimed her. Mavis gripped Basil's hand with unexpected strength and made him swear on their love that he would honor these wishes. Started thinking about getting married again. He was still a young man, and living alone as a mountain bachelor was lonely and challenging. When a widow from Gatlinburg named Truly Jane Lawson, who was 20 years younger than Basil, started showing interest in him, he was drawn to the idea of starting over with someone who could help him get over his loss. Truly Jane was everything that when Basil proposed to Mavis in the spring of 1904, just 6 months after she had been young, active, and free from superstitions and fears. She laughed at mountain folklore, dismissed talk of supernatural phenomena as ignorant nonsense, and made it clear that she intended to modernize Basil's rudimentary cabin if she were to become his wife. The first change that Truly Jane insisted on was replacing Basil's handmade wooden bed with a proper metal bed frame that she ordered from a catalogue company in Knoxville. The new bed was a work of art, made of solid iron painted with white enamel, with decorative brass fittings and a chandelier. Truly Jane accepted Mavis's death on the condition that the cabin be completely redecorated to suit her more sophisticated tastes. Basil was perplexed by his apparent reluctance to part with the old wooden bed that had served as his marriage bed with Mavis. He had promised Mavis that her quilts would never come into contact with metal, but he also knew that refusing to do so was understandable. The headboard, which featured intricate scroll work, was the exact type of modern convenience that Truly Jane associated with civilized living. He tried to make amends by keeping Mavis's quilts in a trunk, telling Truly Jane that they had sentimental value and that he wasn't ready to use them yet. For several months, this arrangement worked well enough. They slept on the new metal bed with quilts that Truly Jane had brought from her own house, and Mavis's masterpiece was kept safely tucked away with her other quilts. He knew that a proper bed would strain their new marriage before it had even started. Creations, but the long, cold mountain winters meant that even Truly Jane's heavy quilts were insufficient to keep them warm in the drafty cabin By December 1904, on one especially chilly night, when the wind howled through Cad's Cove like the voices of the restless dead, truly Jane shivered under their blankets and made what seemed like a perfectly reasonable request. "Basil," she said, "I know those, although your first wife's quilts hold sentimental value, it would be stupid to leave them unworn during a cold spell. Can't we just use one of them tonight?" She must have intended them to keep people warm, Basil sensed. Given Jane's reasonable request and her obvious discomfort with the cold, Basil made a decision that would haunt him for the few who remained. His blood turned to ice at the suggestion. But how could he explain to his new wife that he had promised on his deathbed to keep Mavis's quilt away from metal? How could he tell a pragmatic modern woman that he believed his dead wife's needlework was somehow charged with supernatural power? The red flannel square in the trunk was Mavis's masterpiece, the quilt with the blazing red center that had taken her 2 years to complete. Basil knew he had made a terrible mistake the moment the quilt touched the metal bed frame. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and he could swear he heard a sound like distant thunder, even though the night was clear and cloudless. For a brief moment, Basil believed he saw Mavis's face looking up at him from the fabric as the center of the quilt started to glow with a light unrelated to the oil lamp on their bedside table. Her expression was one of deep disappointment that made his heart hurt, but Jane actually saw none of this. She was thrilled with the lovely quilt, running her hands over the intricate stitching and marveling at as she sat down beneath the quilt. She remarked, "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. It's almost like it's alive. Your first wife certainly knew her needlework," she added. If only she had realized how true those words were, she might have lived to see another sunrise. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the valley, and Basil found himself listening for sounds that had no place in the natural world, while truly Jane curled happily under Mavis's masterpiece and Basil lay awake next to her, unable to get rid of the feeling that he was betraying both women with this arrangement. It was shortly after midnight when the first flash of light filled the room, and Jane woke up with a gasp. Her eyes wide with fear, she found herself surrounded by an electrical display that defied all natural law. The sound of Mavis's voice carried on the wind, calling out warnings that arrived too late to save anyone. The metal bed frame had turned into a conductor, channeling power from an impossible source, and Jane could actually feel electricity running through her body as she lay trapped beneath Mavis's masterpiece. The red flannel center was blazing like a miniature sun, and the fabric itself was glowing and pulsing with energy that seemed to come from within. She tried to scream, to throw off the quilt, and Basil, who was lying next to her, was going through his own kind of hell. He could see Mavis standing at the foot of the bed, her spirit more solid and real than it had any right to be, watching with satisfaction as her final promise was fulfilled. However, the electrical charge had paralyzed her muscles, leaving her conscious but unable to move as the power built to a crescendo that would have been visible from miles away if anyone had been awake to witness it. When the neighbors arrived at the Estip cabin the following morning, driven by rumors of the strange light and concerned for the family's well-being, they discovered a scene that would be etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. The explosion of light that followed was so brilliant that it briefly turned night into day before plunging the valley back into darkness. The remains of Basil were discovered in the middle of the bed, or more accurately, what was left of him was reduced to charred bones and ash due to the extreme heat that melted the metal bed frame into twisted, unidentifiable shapes. The wooden floor beneath the bed was also burned through to the crawl space below, forming a perfect circle of destruction that ended exactly where the quilt had been laid. But what really made the scene surreal was that Mavis's quilt was in perfect condition. Not a single stitch, thread was burned. The red flannel center was still blazing with color, and the intricate design was just as flawless as the day Mavis had finished it. Jane had completely disappeared. There was no body, no remains, and no indication that she had ever been there other than the depression in the bed where she had been lying, and a few pieces of her nightgown that had survived the destruction. The area was like an island of preservation, in a sea of destruction, somehow shielded from the very force that had caused such total annihilation around it. Escaped the devastation, the neighbors searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but they were unable to find any evidence of Basil's second wife's whereabouts. Some speculated that she had been vaporized by the same force that killed Basil, while others suggested that Mavis's ghost had pulled her rival into whatever realm ghosts inhabit when they aren't among the living. This was the most unsettling discovery occurred when the neighbors looked more closely at the quilt. Sewn into the red flannel center, in stitches so tiny they were nearly invisible, were words that no one remembered seeing before death to those who break their promises to the dead. The letter appeared to move and shift when viewed directly, and several witnesses claimed to have heard Mavis's voice saying the words out loud when they leaned in to look at despite the clear night and the absence of any storm activity. The local authorities in that isolated mountain community declared Basil's death to be an accident brought on by a lightning strike. However, the mountain people knew better, understanding that some vows are inscribed not only in the fabric of reality itself, but also in the heart. The quilt itself became a source of both fascination and terror in Cat's Cove after she spent 2 years sowing her supernatural vengeance into it to create a weapon that would patiently wait for the right moment to strike. No one dared to use it, and it was eventually sold to a traveling merchant who dealt in oddities and curiosities, a man who either didn't believe the stories about the merchant brought the quilt to his store in Gatlinburg because of its reputation, or because he believed he could make money off of it. There, it was dubbed the Cussing cover, a reference to both its supernatural qualities and the vibrant language that anyone who came into contact with it seemed to acquire. However, the tale of the Cussing cover didn't stop with its sale over the pattern was consistent throughout the decades that followed. Someone would buy the quilt, drawn by its unquestionable beauty and the dramatic tale of its creation, take it home and use it on their bed despite the warnings about its deadly past. Eventually, someone would violate the unwritten rules governing the quilt's use, placing it on a metal bed. The most well-documented instance occurred in 1923, when a wealthy Knoxville collector bought the quilt for his antique collection. Despite being warned about its history, he displayed it on a metal bed in his guest room, believing the stories were just mountain superstition meant to increase the quilt's value. 3 days later, he was discovered dead, or they would violate the memory of its creator in some other way, and Mavis's vengeance would strike again. By the 1940s, the quilt had acquired such a sinister reputation that antique dealers refused to handle it, and it vanished from public view for several decades. However, mountain people have long memories, and the stories about the Cussing cover have spread. His body was burned beyond recognition, lying in a perfectly circular area of destruction. The Cherokee elders, who still remember the old ways, believe that Mavis's spirit is trapped in that quilt. It has been passed down from generation to generation. Every few years, someone would claim to have seen it in an antique shop, a estate sale, or in the home of someone who didn't know its history. Every few years, there would be another case of someone who was found burned to death in circumstances that defied rational explanation. According to Cherokee tradition, items that have been charged with such strong emotions become containers for the supernatural, and since she is bound to it by the depth of her love for Basil and her anger at his betrayal, they believe that she will never find peace until the quilt is destroyed. However, they also caution that destroying it could release her spirit in ways that would be even more dangerous, perhaps in an antique store in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, or perhaps in the home of a collector who believes they have discovered a stunning piece of Appalachian folk art. Mavis's masterpiece awaits. The Cussing cover remains as stunning and lethal as the day it took its first victims, poised to strike again at any moment. Breaking that container could unleash forces beyond human control. The next time you see a quilt that appears too flawless, too exquisite, or too intricately designed to be the creation of mortal hands, remember Mavis Estep and her last vow. Keep in mind that some art is made not to provide solace, but to bring about justice, and whatever you do, if you are stupid enough to disregard the warnings that have been written in blood and stitched in supernatural thread. In the Tennessee mountains, some promises are kept forever, regardless of the number of innocent lives that must be sacrificed in order to honor them. If you ever come across a quilt with a fiery red center and stitching that appears to move in the corner of your eye, don't take it home, don't put it on your bed, and never, ever disregard the warnings of the dead. Tau 5 Atagahi, the Forbiddance, healing lake deeper place that is so sacred and dangerous that saying its name out loud is said to invite disaster upon your entire bloodline, is located in the most remote wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient Cherokee hunting paths vanish into mist and shadows. The Cherokee called it Atagahi, the Enchanted Lake, and for many generations before white settlers ever arrived, entered these mountains, which were nature's best kept secret and a place where the laws of life and death subvert forces that predate human civilization. What makes this story especially horrifying is not only what happened to the people who discovered this magical location, but also what still happens to anyone who is stupid enough to search for it, because Atagahi is still there. According to Cherokee tradition, Atagahi was created in the early days of the world, when the earth was still soft and the line separating the spiritual and physical realms was as thin as morning mist. The Great Spirit, in his infinite wisdom, chose specific people to visit Atagahi, which is still hidden and hungry for human souls who dare to violate its sacred boundaries. Locations as safe havens where injured forest creatures could go to recover from their wounds and illnesses. The most potent of these healing locations was Atagahi, a lake whose violet-colored waters had the capacity to heal any wound, cure any illness, and even bring life back to those who were on the verge of death. However, this power came with a strict requirement. The lake itself was said to be a thing of impossible beauty, hidden in a circular valley, surrounded by cliffs so steep and smooth that no human could climb them. The only way to reach Atagahi was through a series of hidden caves that twisted deep beneath the mountains, passages known only to the spirits who guarded the lake, and the animals who had needed its magic to survive gained the right to access its healing waters. The Cherokee people described the lake as being perfectly round, with a surface that was so clear and still that it reflected not only the sky above, but also visions of the spirit world itself. The water was a deep violet, color that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and plants and flowers that were only found on earth grew along its shores. The most amazing part of Atagahi was what happened when injured animals reached its shores. Bears with infected wounds would wade into the violet waters and emerge completely healed, their scars disappearing as if they had never existed. Birds with broken wings would drink from the lake and take flight immediately, their bones mended. And herbs so potent that a single leaf could cure ailments that baffled the greatest Cherokee medicine men, and their strength restored. Even animals that should have died from their wounds would somehow drag themselves to the shores of Atagahi and return to the forest whole and healthy. For centuries, the Cherokee revered the sacred lake as nature's own emergency room, a place where the normal rules of injury and death simply did not apply. Prohibition against looking for Atagahi, because they knew that some of the Great Spirit's gifts were not intended for a human use, and that the healing waters were only available to creatures that coexisted peacefully with nature without attempting to manipulate or take advantage of it. Cherokee hunters would quickly flee if they caught a glimpse of the mist rising from the hidden valley, because they knew that even a chance sighting of the Forbiddance medicine men would only whisper about Atagahi and convey warnings that protected their people from its supernatural guardians. But in the harsh winter of 1847, human desperation and the intense love of a father for his dying child would test these ancient prohibitions. Kununa was a young Cherokee hunter who was well known in his village for his tracking prowess and his in-depth knowledge of the mountain. Despite the efforts of the ville's most powerful medicine men and every urban ritual in their vast wilderness, he was also a loving father whose 5-year-old son Sequoia had succumbed to a wasting disease that was slowly eating away at the boy from within. As winter tightened its hold on the mountains and Sequoia's body, Sequoia grew weaker every day. As his condition worsened, Kununa was faced with the worst decision any parent could make. Either he would violate the most sacred Cherokee tradition and seek out the healing waters of Atagahi, or he would watch his son die while upholding the ancient laws that had protected his people for generations. The decision became unavoidable when the medicine men finally acknowledged that they had tried every possible earthly remedy. If Sequoia was to survive, it would need magic beyond what they could offer. Kununa's choice to seek Atagahi was not made hastily or selfishly. He knew that he was putting not only his own life in danger, but also the lives of his entire village at risk. Cherokee tradition taught that breaking sacred law could result in collective punishment, meaning that the spirits might stop protecting everyone, not just the individual transgressor. But as he saw his son fighting for his life, Kununa concluded that some risks were worthwhile, even if the results would haunt him for the rest of his life. Using bits and pieces of old tales and vaguely remembered instructions from legends passed down by the elders, Kununa spent weeks searching for Atagahi in remote areas of the Smoky Mountains that no Cherokee had ever visited. The farther he ventured into the wilderness, the more the natural world appeared to oppose him. Animals fled at his approach, plants withered when he touched them, and the air itself grew thick and oppressive, if the mountains themselves were telling him to turn back. He followed animal tracks that seemed to lead toward a destination that existed more in the spirit world than in physical reality. Kununa would later describe his experience as a moment of divine intervention as he sat exhausted and hopeless beside a creek that seemed to lead nowhere. It was during his 3rd week of searching, when he had started to lose hope that he would ever find the legendary lake, that he began to pray with an intensity born of absolute desperation and offered his own life to the great. During that moment of total surrender, the hidden passage revealed itself. What had seemed to be solid stone suddenly shimmered and became translucent, revealing a cave entrance that had been invisible moments before. The opening was just big enough. Spirit, in exchange for his son's healing, promised to accept any punishment if only Sequoia could be saved. Kununa realized that he was being invited to enter, that his fervent prayer had somehow gained him entry to the forbidden realm. But he also realized that this invitation came with no assurance of safety, that he was entering a place where, from its depths, came a sound like distant singing voices that seemed to be calling his name in languages that predated human speech. The cave system that led to Atagahi was unlike anything Kununa had ever experienced. The passages twisted and branched in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics, sometimes leading upward when they should have led down, and other times opening into vast chambers that were far too big to be explained by human rules, big enough to fit inside the mountains that housed them. The walls were covered in paintings that changed and moved while he watched. Some of the paintings showed a Cherokee hunter being torn apart by spirit bears, while others showed trespassers being dragged into the violet waters and changed into fantastical creatures that were neither human nor animal. As Kununa ventured farther into the network of caves, he started to come across the guardians of Atagahi spirits, who appeared as giant animals with eyes that blazed like stars and voices that could speak straight into his head. One such creature was a huge bear that stood erect like a man, but was covered in glittering fur. When Kuna told him about his dying son, the bear spirit studied him for what seemed like hours before moving aside, but not before sending a warning that chilled Kununa's blood. You may pass a desperate father, but know that every step you take toward the lake binds you more tightly to a fate you cannot imagine. The healing waters An unearthly light blocked his path and demanded to know why a human dared to seek the forbidden lake. The last chamber of the cave system opened onto a scene that left Kanuna stunned with awe and fear. It was like a vision from the world of the gods, with the entire hidden valley shimmering like a dream due to the violet waters glowing with an inner light. The lake was perfectly round, maybe 100 yards across, and surrounded by cliffs that ascended directly into a sky that appeared different from the one he had left behind, one that was deeper, more purple, and full of stars that moved in patterns that were painful for his eyes to follow. Around the lake shores, animals of all kinds moved in harmony, and creatures that ought to have been natural enemies drank side by side from waters that cured every wound and the hawk quiver. Broken Wing drank from the lake and immediately took flight, its bones mended and its strength restored. Most astonishingly, an old bear emerged as a deer with a massive wound in its side, waded into the violet waters and emerged moments later completely whole. Its injury vanished without leaving even a scar. For a few minutes, Kanuna just stood at the edge of the hidden valley, overcome by the beauty and strength of what he was seeing. The creature, which had obviously been dying, had grey and patchy fur, moved slowly and painfully, and entered the deepest part of the lake. It emerged, looking young and vital, transformed into the prime of life by the healing power of Atagahi's sacred waters. The lake bed was covered with items that glowed with the same violet light as the water healing stones, medicine plants, and artifacts of power that had been accumulating there since the beginning of time. It was so clear and pure that he could see the bottom of the lake despite its considerable depth, and what he saw there made his heart race with desperate hope. If he could just fill a container with this miraculous water and bring it back to his dying son, Sequoia would be saved. But as Kanuna reached for the bottle of water he had brought with him, all of the animals in the lake abruptly stopped what they were doing and turned to look at him. The scene's peaceful harmony was broken like glass, and the animals' eyes, which had previously been gentle and calm, were nearly suffocated by the intense attention. A huge elk, its antlers wider than a man could reach, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that reverberated through the air and spirit. "Human, you have been allowed to watch Atagahi heal, but you have not been given permission to take from its waters. Go now while mercy is still available, still feasible." Kanuna's heart ached when he recognized the awful decision he was being forced to make. Either he followed the sacred taboo and took the healing water he sorely needed, facing the repercussions, or he disregarded the warning and went back home to watch his son die. Kanuna dropped to his knees next to the violet lake and started filling his water bottle, his hands shaking with fear and resolve as the healing waters flowed into the container. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying the moment Atagahi's sacred water touched the ordinary material of Kanuna's bottle, and the entire hidden valley was filled with the spirits that felt appropriate, like a father watching his child deteriorate. Erupted in supernatural chaos, turning the once otherworldly purple sky blood red and spinning like a whirlpool. The birds became winged shadows that blotted out the light. The bears became giants with claws like spears. The deer developed antlers that could pierce the sky. And the lake itself became the most terrifying of all. The lake spirit, a creature of such power and beauty, rose from the depths of Atagahi to respond to the violation of its sacred nature. The violet waters, which had been serene and motionless like glass, started to churn and boil with a wrath that seemed to shake the mountain's very foundations. She was tall as a tree, with skin that alternated between human flesh and flowing water, hair that moved like waterfalls, and eyes that held the wisdom and wrath of centuries. Her voice was like the sound of rushing rivers and crashing waves, and when she spoke, it pierced not only the Cherokee people's ears, but also their very souls. Her majesty was like staring into the sun. "You have stolen from the sacred waters and violated the ancient compact between spirit and flesh. This transgression cannot go unpunished, but your love for your dying child has moved the heart of the Great Spirit, so you will be offered a choice that will determine not just your fate, the lake spirit said, her voice resonating through dimensions that human minds were never meant to perceive. However, Kuna could keep the healing water and save his son's life, but in doing so, he would become the eternal guardian of Atagahi, obligated to defend the lake from future human trespassers by any means necessary. He would be changed into something more than human, but less than spirit, granted immortality, and the fate of all humans who might attempt to exploit the gifts meant for innocent creatures was as terrible as it was simple. Supernatural ability, but he would always be cut off from the mortal world. He would never be able to hold his son again, watch him grow up, or be the father he had so desperately tried to be. Alternatively, Kanuna could return to the lake, pour the stolen water back into it, and accept his son's death as the will of the Great Spirit. Sequoia would perish and Kanuna would have to live with the knowledge that he had held his child's salvation in his hands and decided to let it slip away, while standing in that supernatural valley with the stolen healing water in his hands and the spirits of Atagai. However, the lake spirit would pardon his transgression and permit him to return to his village to live out his natural life as a human being. As the healing water touched his lips in a ritual that sealed his transformation, Kanuna watched his every move and made the decision that would turn him from a desperate father into something far more dangerous. He decided to save his son, accepting the terrible price that the lake spirit demanded. Kanuna felt his humanity dwindle water through sand, replaced by something ancient and unforgiving that cared more about defending the sacred rather than human emotions or desires. The trip back to his village marked the final time Kanuna would interact with people as one of their own, but the healing water fulfilled its promise. Sequoia's wasting illness vanished like morning mist, and his strength and vitality returned as though he had never been sick. Within days of Kanuna's return, the appreciative village tried to celebrate his success and discover the secret of his son's miraculous recovery, only to discover that their hero had changed beyond recognition. His eyes were now burning with an inhuman light, his voice carried harmonics that made listeners' bones ache, and his very presence seemed to distort reality in ways that scared even the most courageous warriors. Kanuna started to undergo changes that made it impossible for him to stay in the village. His skin turned the color of Atagai's waters. His strength grew to the point where he could uproot trees with just his hands, and his tracking skills became so extraordinary that he was able to follow a person's spiritual essence over great distances. Most unsettling of all, he started to exhibit information that no mortal should know, such as his neighbor's innermost thoughts, the locations of hidden objects, and the precise time of each villager's death. The Cherokee elders, seeing the signs of Kanuna's spiritual transformation, realized that he was no longer genuinely one of them. With heavy hearts, but a clear purpose, they carried out the ceremony of separation, formally releasing him from his human responsibilities and acknowledging his new role as a guardian spirit. Kanuna accepted this choice without objecting, understanding that his metamorphosis was both required and irreversible. He collected his few remaining belongings, bid his sleeping son farewell for the last time, and entered the mountains to start his never-ending watch as Atagahi's protector. But this is where the story begins. As the decades went by and white settlers started to explore the deeper reaches of the Smoky Mountains, stories about a figure that hunters and hikers encountered in the most remote areas of the wilderness began to circulate. While descriptions varied, some details remained consistent, making Kanuna's watch truly terrifying for modern audiences. These interactions followed a troubling pattern: a tall, powerfully built man with skin that appeared to alternate between human flesh and flowing water, eyes that glowed with violet light, and an aura of such primal power that wild animals would flee at his approach. The figure, known to mountain folk as the Violet Man, would appear to travelers who appeared to be looking for something more than just a pleasant hike through the mountains. In the woods, he possessed a remarkable ability to detect when someone was looking for the fabled healing lake, regardless of whether they were aware of its actual name, had only heard tales of a location where miraculous healings could be found. When the Violet Man came across such seekers, he would present them with an option that was similar to the one he had been given centuries before: either turn around and live or move on. The majority of those who came into contact with the Violet Man was sensible enough to heed his warning and stop looking for Atagai, but some, motivated by desperation, greed, or just plain human stubbornness, decided to disregard his advice and continue their journey deeper into the wilderness. These people were never seen alive again, though their bodies were occasionally discovered. Weeks or the Cherokee, who still reside in the area, understand that these deaths occurred because, months later, in circumstances that perplexed investigators, the corpses were consistently found in impossible places, such as at the base of cliff faces with no way to descend, in the middle of raging rivers with no way to cross, or just sitting calmly in clearings where they seem to have died without any sign of injury or struggle, are not coincidental. Rather, they are the outcome of breaking the ancient law that forbade people from seeking Atagai. They know that Kanuna changed into the everlasting protector of the healing lake, which prevents people from discovering and using the holy waters. His love for his son drove him to break the law, but his metamorphosis forced him to uphold it. With supernatural vigilance, he has become what he in recent decades, as the Great Smoky Mountains National Park has seen an increase in visitors. Reports of encounters with the Violet Man have become more frequent and disturbing. Park rangers frequently receive accounts from hikers who claim to have been warned away from certain areas by a figure who fits Kanuna's description. Previously, they feared a guardian spirit whose duty to protect the sacred overrides any human considerations of mercy or compassion, but the rangers themselves know better. They have seen the missing person reports, studied the disappearance patterns, and observed that some remote areas of the park appear to be protected by forces that go beyond normal wildlife or natural hazards. Officially, these reports are dismissed as encounters with regular park personnel or simply hallucinations caused by exhaustion and altitude. The most terrifying modern, although these reports are uncommon and frequently written off as hoaxes or delusions, they contain enough specific information to imply that some modern seekers have succeeded in breaking through the spiritual barriers that typically conceal the healing lake from view. According to these accounts, the lake still exists in its original location. Modern witnesses also report that Atagohi has evolved into something far more dangerous than the tranquil healing sanctuary described in Cherokee tradition. The lake is now guarded by an entire army of spirits, not just Kanuna, but the souls of everyone who has died. The hidden valley still glows with violet light and continues to serve as a sanctuary for injured animals from throughout the region. According to these terrifying modern accounts, these guardian spirits have changed over the past centuries as a result of their proximity to Atagahi's power. They are no longer entirely human or animal beings that exist only to stop further violations of the sacred space. Anyone who is able to reach Atagahi has to choose between healing and transformation, but a series of supernatural tests intended to assess their deservingness and intentions. The guardian spirits, under the leadership of Kanuna himself, put potential violators through trials that test not only their physical bravery, but also the innermost parts of their souls, forcing them to acknowledge whether they are seeking healing out of genuine love or just to fulfill their own self-centered desires. Those who fail these trials are sent to the Eternal Guard, where they will be transformed into spirit warriors whose sole duty is to defend the lake from future intruders. However, even those who pass the trials and demonstrate their worthiness must make a decision that has gotten worse with each generation. The healing waters of Atgai still have the ability to perform miracles, but according to Cherokee elders who still recall the old tales, the cost of using them has skyrocketed. As more and more people have broken the sacred prohibition, they claim that anyone who drinks from Atagahi's waters will be healed of whatever ailment led them to seek out the Forbidden Lake, but they will also be permanently bound to the lake, adding to Kanuna's army of guardian spirits who must spend eternity preventing others from making the next time, hiking deep in the Great Smoky Mountains. And you hear tales of a hidden lake where miraculous healings can be found. Keep in mind Kuna's decision and the sacrifice they made for the healing, the loss of everything that makes life worthwhile, including human connection, the capacity to love and be loved, and the basic joy of being a mortal being in a mortal world. If you ever see a tall person with violet-tinted skin and eyes that glow with otherworldly light, don't disregard his warning to turn around, because in these ancient mountains, where the line separating the physical and spiritual worlds is thinner than ever, remember that some gifts are too dangerous for human hands, and that some power comes with costs that can never be fully calculated until it's too late to turn back. Atagahi is still out there, still hidden, still healing the innocent creatures of the forest, while remaining forever beyond human reach. And Kanuna is still watching, still guarding. Nowhere else on earth are the greatest tragedies those who seek forbidden knowledge and fail to find it, but those who find exactly what they're looking for and realize that some prices are too terrible for any human soul to pay. The story of 6 Lydia's wedding day revenge, when the Great Smoky Mountains leaves blazed like fire against the darkening sky, and the first whisper of winter's approach, whispered through the ancient world, tells of the bride who never dies, and the price paid for a father's desperate love that broke the oldest laws in the world. The Greenbrier Lodge, a sprawling mountain retreat where America's elite could escape the stresses of modern life and immerse themselves in the timeless beauty of the Tennessee wilderness, welcomed the wealthy and privileged who sought solace from the problems of a world on the verge of war. However, what the lodge's patrons and employees didn't appreciate when May, then 23 years old, arrived at the Greenbrier Lodge in September 1939, she was unquestionably the most beautiful woman anyone at the resort had ever seen. She was tall, graceful, and had alabaster skin. Little did they know that they were about to become unwilling participants in a love story so tragic and violent that it would turn their peaceful sanctuary into one of the most haunted places in all of Appalachia. Lydia had the kind of beauty that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection. She had traveled to the lodge with her wealthy family from Charleston, South Carolina, supposedly for a month-long vacation before her wedding. Her auburn hair caught fire in the lamplight, and her green eyes held depths of intelligence and passion that could make strong men weak in the knees. Lydia's month at the Greenbrier Lodge was not meant to be a simple vacation. Rather, it was meant to be her last time of freedom before she entered into a marriage arranged by her father for purely financial reasons. Thomas Ashford III, 42, was nearly twice Lydia's age and was known for being one of the most eligible bachelors in the South and the heir to a textile fortune. He had already mysteriously married to wives due to cruelty and debauchery that were discussed in the finest drawing rooms of Charleston society. His interest in marrying Lydia had nothing to do with love, but rather with her family's shipping, connections, and her sizable inheritance. Lydia's father, drowning in gambling debts and desperate to keep his social standing, had effectively sold his daughter to Ashford in exchange for financial salvation, and no amount of Lydia's tears or entreaties could change his mind at the Greenbrier Lodge. However, Lydia met James Whitmore, a 25-year-old man who was incredibly attractive and working as a hunting guide for the lodge's wealthy guests, who would completely alter the course of Lydia's tragic story. He came from a low-income mountain family that had lived in the Smoky Mountains for many generations, but he was more educated and sophisticated than any gentleman Lydia had ever met. More significantly, he saw past her beauty to the passionate, intelligent woman underneath, and for the first time in Lydia's life, she felt what it was like to be loved for who she was rather than what she stood for in their romance. James was Lydia's guide on her daily horseback rides through the mountain trails, so it started out innocently enough. However, as the weeks went by, Their relationship grew into something neither of them had anticipated or planned. They would meet in secret, snatching moments together in secret clearings and deserted cabins, sharing fears and dreams, and organizing as September turned to October and Lydia's wedding date drew nearer. Their desperation increased and they made increasingly rash plans. James assured Lydia that he would find a way to make enough money to support her in the way she deserved. But Lydia vowed that she would prefer to live in poverty with him and live than in luxury with Thomas Ashford, would run away to Canada or Mexico, elope to a far-off state where Lydia's father couldn't find them, disappear into the mountains, and live like hermits instead of being torn apart by a marriage that would ruin them both. However, these were the desperate dreams of two young people who didn't realize the brutal power of money and social duty. Lydia's father had too much invested in the marriage to let his daughter escape, and Thomas Ashford was not the type of man who would put up with being humiliated by a mountain guide and the disobedient bride. The wedding was set for Halloween, October 31st, 1939, but it would not be clear how ironic that date would be until much later. The ceremony would take place in the Greenbrier Lodge's Grand Ballroom, and there would be a reception to celebrate the union of two influential Southern families. Lydia, as the wedding date drew near, she retreated into a state of numb despair, going through the motions of preparation while her spirit slowly died inside. She had done everything she could to avoid her fate, including begging, pleading, threatening, and even trying to flee twice before being apprehended and brought back by her father's hired men. Standing in her bridal suite, Lydia wore a wedding gown that had cost more than most people's annual income. She looked at her reflection in a mirror, which appeared to depict her as a beautifully dressed corpse rather than a bride. The dress was a work of art made of silk and lace, with a train so long that two attendants were needed to manage it, and a veil that had been made by nuns in a French convent. Lydia looked stunning, like a fairy tale princess who has learned that her prince is a monster. She was utterly miserable. James had promised to meet her before the ceremony in order to try one last time to persuade her to flee with him. They had planned to meet in the lodge library precisely noon, 1 hour prior to the wedding starting time. Lydia had informed him that this would be their last chance, that if they at 5 minutes before noon. Lydia knew that she wouldn't have the strength to resist him if he stayed nearby, so she made him promise that if she chose duty over love, he would leave the mountains right away and never try to contact her again. If she couldn't find the courage to flee together today, she would go through with the marriage and they would never see each other again. She decided to leave with James no matter what, leaving her family and her fortune for the chance at true happiness. As she walked through the lodge in her wedding dress, guests and staff stopped to stare at her. She left her bridal suite and headed toward the library, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. Ethereal beauty, unaware that they were watching a bride's last journey toward either salvation or damnation. However, Lydia arrived at the library empty, and after waiting for 10, 20, and 30 minutes, her hope gradually turned to confusion, and finally to crushing despair. James never arrived at 12:45, just 15 minutes before her wedding. Scheduled to start, Lydia finally came to terms with the awful fact that the man she loved had left her. It was unclear to Lydia whether James had lost his courage, been duped by her father, or simply realized that he couldn't support her as she deserved. James had decided not to fight for their love when it mattered most. What Lydia didn't know, and what she would never discover in her short life, was that James hadn't left her voluntarily. Thomas Ashford was suspicious. James had been abducted the night before by men Ashford had hired, beaten unconscious, and taken to a remote cabin deep in the mountains where he was being held prisoner. By the time he managed to escape, Lydia would already be dead, and his failure to meet her would have been averted. James was aware of his bride's behavior and determined to eliminate any potential interference with his plans, become a source of guilt that would drive him insane and ultimately lead to his own violent death. On October 31st, 1939, at precisely 1 p.m., Lydia May White walked down the aisle of the grand ballroom of the Greenbrier Lodge, wearing the most exquisite wedding gown anyone in attendance had ever seen, and she carried a bouquet if she was a woman, attending her own funeral, going through the motions of a ceremony that would kill everything inside her that mattered. The guests watched a radiant bride move gracefully toward her future husband while holding white roses that trembled in her shaking hands. However, those who looked closely could see the tears streaming down her face and the expression of complete despair in her green eyes. When Lydia arrived at the altar and took her place next to him, Thomas Ashford leaned in and whispered something in her ear that made her uncomfortable. Ashford's smug grin made many wedding guests uneasy, but none of them could have explained why he appeared to be someone who had just won a particularly difficult game, someone who took pleasure not only in victory, but also in his opponent's defeat. The wedding ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance that money could purchase, but there was an undercurrent of wrongness that made even the most unaware guests feel uneasy. Lydia's answers to the minister's questions were hardly audible, her voice breaking with each word she spoke. Her entire body stiffened with disgust at everything he said, which was obviously not words of love or assurance, was compelled to say "I do," and when the time came, there was such a profound silence that the whole ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would have the guts to say no. However, years of conditioning and social pressure proved to be stronger than love or self-preservation, and Lydia eventually whispered the words that would seal her when the minister declared them husband and wife. Lydia's heart broke so completely that some of the guests later claimed to have heard glass breaking. Even though there was no glass broken, Thomas Ashford leaned in to kiss his new bride, and his triumphant expression was so ugly that it caused the children in the audience to start crying. The kiss was brief, but the reception that followed was a lavish affair with dancing, drinking, and celebrations that went well into the evening. But Lydia handled it all like a ghost, smiling when someone spoke to her. It was possessive, acclaiming, and by the time it was over, Lydia's eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality that made her look more like a beautiful doll than a living woman. It was just before midnight when Lydia eventually left the reception and headed to the honeymoon suite that had been set up for her and her new husband. She danced when needed, but was obviously absent in every way that mattered. So those who attempted to talk to her ended up speaking to someone who was physically present but spiritually gone, as if her soul had simply left her body the moment she became Mrs. Thomas Ashford. In the honeymoon suite, Lydia stood alone, still wearing her wedding dress, but with her veil torn and her bouquet crushed. Her husband Thomas was still downstairs, drinking with his friends and bragging about his gorgeous young wife, but Lydia knew that he would soon join her, and that the nightmare of her wedding day would turn into the even worse nightmare of her married life. Lydia looked around at the romantic decorations and felt nothing, but as Lydia looked at the length of silk rope that had been used to tie back one of the curtains, she noticed with disgust and despair that the honeymoon suite had been decorated with garlands and streamers. As Lydia stared at the rope, a plan for escaping Thomas Ashford and her intolerable future that didn't require her to endure the repercussions of her father's greed, and her hands seemed to know what to do, as if some part of her had been planning this moment for much longer than she consciously realized. Lydia untied the silk rope from the curtain and started to fashion it into a noose, displaying her own cowardice with a calmness that was more terrifying than any hysteria. As she worked, she thought about James and wondered if he was thinking. Lydia dragged a chair to the middle of the room, right under the main ceiling beam, and climbed onto it, while still wearing her wedding dress. The dress was so ornate and heavy that it made her movements awkward, but she was able to secure the rope to the beam and slip the chair onto it. Lydia asked whether he regretted his decision to leave her, if he would even care, and what she had done. The Story 7 Elkmont Ghost Town. the vanishing community in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient trees whisper secrets older than memory and life she might have had if she had been braver or if James had been stronger, made her pause for a moment as she considered her family and the scandal her death would cause. Elkmont was once a bustling mountain town with hundreds of families who carved their lives out of the wilderness and created a society that seemed destined to last forever. But when progress came calling in the form of government agents and park officials, the entire community refused to stay gone. Morning mist clings to forgotten foundations like the breath of the dead. Began as a logging community in the early 1900s. But what makes Elkmont so terrifying isn't just that it was destroyed. It never truly died. And every year new evidence emerges that the town and its lost residents are slowly, but surely trying to return. Elkmont was systematically dismantled, its residents scattered to the winds, and its very existence nearly erased from history. The town was constructed around the operations of the Little River Logging Company, which had acquired thousands of acres of pristine wilderness with the sole intent of cutting down every tree big enough to be profitable. The company needed workers, and there were dozens of such settlements dotted throughout the Smoky Mountains during the Great Timber Boom that would eventually strip millions of acres of ancient forest from the area. And laborers required housing, so Elkmont appeared practically overnight in a valley that had been untouched wilderness only months earlier. However, unlike other logging camps, which established makeshift communities that would be dismantled as soon as the local trees were depleted, Elkmont was intended to be permanent, and the logging company constructed substantial homes rather than makeshift ones, in order to encourage workers to bring their families and establish roots. Shacks built schools, churches, and general stores. By 1910, Elkmont had developed into a legitimate town with 200 residents, complete with a post office, railroad depot, and even a small hospital. The people of Elkmont were a close-knit community united by, they were mostly families from the surrounding mountains who had lived in these hills for generations and knew the rhythms and dangers of wilderness life. They built their homes out of the same trees they cut for profit and grew gardens in clearings cut from old forests. They were aware of the harsh realities of mountain life and the hazardous work of industrial logging, and established a society that struck a balance between the demands of industrial labor and the customs of mountain people. However, despite Elkmont's prosperity, its citizens had a persistent sense of unease because they had always known that the land was alive, that the forests, streams, and hidden valleys had a consciousness that existed for millennia before human settlement. Workers would describe feeling watched while they worked or hearing voices calling from deep in the woods even when no one else was around tools, as operations began destroying large areas of ancient forest. Many Elkmont residents reported strange phenomena that suggested the land was responding to this assault with something approaching anger. The most unsettling were the accidents that started to plague the logging operations, with increasing frequency of equipment failures that shouldn't have been possible, trees that would vanish overnight from secure storage areas only to reappear days later in impossible locations, balanced on high tree branches, buried in stream beds, or arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence behind their placement. By 1915, Elkmont had developed beyond its beginnings as a simple logging camp. Wealthy tourists from Knoxville and beyond had discovered the cool mountain air and breathtaking scenery, leading to the construction of vacation homes and hunting lodges that seemed to be built in spite of the laws of physics, and injuries that seemed to happen just when workers were considering leaving the mountains and quitting their jobs. Elkmont found itself catering to two very different populations: the wealthy elite who came to experience the wilderness from the safety and comfort of well-appointed accommodations, and the working-class families who had founded the town. This change turned the town into a resort destination, and the Wonderland Hotel was constructed to house these affluent visitors. Brought attitudes and expectations that were fundamentally at odds with the mountain way of life. The wealthy visitors complained about the noise from logging operations, objected to the smoke from wood stoves and sawmills, and saw Elkmont as a charming mountain retreat where they could escape the stresses of modern life and commune with nature in comfort and style. These tensions within the community would turn out to be prophetic. The working families who had constructed Elkmont found themselves increasingly isolated in their own community as they progressively started advocating for changes that would make the resort more suited to their affluent tastes. Their traditional customs were denounced as outdated or unhygienic, and their very existence was viewed as incompatible with the idea of Elkmont as a posh mountain resort. What had started out as a peaceful coexistence of various social classes progressively turned into a silent but enduring dispute over who should determine what Elkmont should be. This dispute was settled not by compromise or discussion, but rather by the abrupt and disastrous involvement of the federal government in 1926, when Congress approved the establishment for the residents of Elkmont the announcement that the government would buy all private land within the proposed park boundaries, remove all people and structures, and restore the entire area to its natural state was nothing short of devastating. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Elkmont found themselves squarely in the path of this massive conservation project. Families who had lived in these mountains for generations were told that they would have to leave because their homes, communities, and entire way of life were incompatible with the government's vision of wilderness preservation. They were also told that their houses would be demolished and that the town they had created out of nothing would be erased as if it had never existed. Had political connections, expensive lawyers, and enough money to fight the government's plans. In court, some of these wealthy vacation homeowners were even granted long-term leases that would allow them to keep their properties for several decades. At first, they thought they would be exempt from this mass eviction, but Elkmont's working families had neither of these resources nor protections. They were given very little as refugees from their own mountains. They were forced to leave behind belongings they couldn't carry and disperse too far off towns and cities where they would live. The evacuation of Elkmont started in 1928 and continued intermittently throughout the 1930s as legal challenges postponed the final property transfers, for not only were they losing their homes, but they were also losing their connection to the land that had defined them as a people for many generations. The process of forcing families to leave was heartbreaking beyond description. These were people whose entire identities were tied to specific places, the hollows where their great-grandparents were buried, the streams where they had learned to fish as children, and the forests where they had hunted and gathered for generations. As the community houses that had been sturdy for decades started to develop structural issues overnight, foundations would crack, roofs would leak, and walls would warp as if the buildings were aging years in a matter of days. Residents reported experiencing supernatural phenomena during the evacuation process, which suggested the land itself was responding to the destruction.